Hello and welcome. This is Operational Excellence with AKS, part of the Building Intelligent Apps series. And with me is Josh Duffney. I'm Steve Morawski. And we're going to we're going to kind of continue on from last week. So last week, Paul and I got a intelligent app deployed onto AKS using the automatic SKU. And we promised we'd be back to talk about what does automatic bring in terms of operability? How do we get that operational excellence with AKS? So first, I'd like to welcome Josh. Josh, glad to have you here,
Glad to be
working
here.
along with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's take just a quick look at some learning objectives here. So we're not going to spend a lot of time in PowerPoint. In fact, this is the last slide we're gonna see. Then we're going to dive right into the tech. But we're going to look at the security posture of AKS Automatic, and I'm starting with this because if you don't know, security is kind of important these days. Microsoft, we've got the Secure Future Initiative project going on, kind of reinforcing the value of security across Microsoft. And I want to point out some of the areas that AKS Automatic sets us up in a better place for our security posture. We're also going to dig into how we troubleshoot applications on AKS, because Josh, I don't know about you, but when I'm operating an application workloads, like I want to be able to get at logs, I want to see metrics. Like and when we talk about moving those things into the cloud, where do I find those things? That always becomes a question for me.
Well, then it always gets tricky if you start to secure your cluster, and then it gets harder to get the logs with kubectl, and there's a bunch of hurdles you got to jump through. So I'm excited to see how that's going to make that easier, because I always end up defaulting doing a little bit less secure just so it's a bit easier for me to get the logs. But I know that's not good. So I should probably stop that. I hope this helps me break of those bad habits that I have. So,
well, hopefully, we'll have a couple of honestly, in prepping for this and in some of the other work I've done with AKS Automatic, the way everything is kind of wired up, there are a few rough edges, but for the most part, I was able to work the way I was used to working, so the security really didn't hamper my ability to operate my workloads. We're also going to take a peek in at how, because we talked about, getting the logs and troubleshooting application, but also looking at metric application and cluster metrics across our Kubernetes cluster, and doing it in a nice, pretty way with managed Grafana. And I realized I misspelled Grafana there, so I'll have to fix that later. It's
F a PH, who knows?
It's an F, but and then finally we're going to talk about scaling in AKS and the various levers that we have for scaling, and why we may only want to use one or two of those levers at a time. But let's start digging into stuff. All right. So this is the application that we have. We deployed last week. It is a creative writer. It's an AI powered app where, for example, let's just try an example. This helps us write a post of some kind, an article of some kind, and link in some product information and things. And we tell it to go get to work, and it goes out and calls some AI services. And there's actually 3 agents. Paul walked us through this last week. And if you want to see more of this application, feel free to go check that one out. At the end, we'll end up with a document. So let's look at the infrastructure behind this application a little bit more. So we spent more time with the application last week. This week, we're going to spend more time with the resources themselves. So we are going to start with the security posture that we have in our AKS Automatic instance. And you can see we've got the SKU kind automatic. There's a couple things that it enables for us right out of the gate, and it kind of highlights some of those things for us right in this little preview window. on our dashboard. But we're going to dig more into the details of that in the actual view of the Kubernetes service. And I'm going through the portal here to show a lot. We're going to drop into the CLI and take a look at some things too that aren't quite as accessible from the portal. But I'm showing you here because one of the points of AKS Automatic is to be able to go from our application to a production ready cluster. And so the things that we're looking at today are what actually get us to that production ready. So one of the most important aspects, I think, of the security posture is in the authentication and authorization. And by default, these clusters are Entra ID integrated. Now, Josh, you've deployed AKS clusters in the past, and normally the default is not going to be Entra ID authentication RBAC enabled.
Correct. Yeah, that so, a little bit of work involved to get that. Yeah.
Yeah, but more to the point, like, that means the authorization and identity for your management of that is central to that cluster.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's and so having visibility across your ecosystem of who has rights and management capability. Like if I would do the AZ AKS get credential command, how do I inventory who actually has access and permissions to that cluster, right? Like, if they've actually got some authorization to it. It's really difficult to tell because you can take those config files and ship them around, and there's all sorts of trouble you can get up to. Well, by tying this into Entra ID, now my Entra ID identity is the source of that, and I can assign permissions to that at various levels. And what that looks like, if we look in access control, so we've got our Azure Kubernetes RBAC, there's cluster admin, there's reader, writer, admin, and cluster admin roles. And you can see we've got a couple of them assigned here, but it gets even cooler, right? So, Josh, when you think about a Kubernetes cluster and you think about applications, and do we dump everything into the same namespace?
No, not usually. No.
Right? And should everyone, or should somebody who needs to administer one application in a particular namespace necessarily have access across your cluster?
No, you'd want to lock that down as best you can.
Right. So we can do that. Now we don't see that as visibly here, but we can if we hop over into our terminal, and we can actually assign permissions at the namespace level, at the namespace scope. So I've already gone ahead and put in I've populated a few variables. And so I'm going to create a role assignment, like AZ role assignment create. I'm giving it the name of Azure Kubernetes Service RBAC Reader. I'm going to give it to you, Josh.
All right.
And I'm going to assign you reader in the namespace. So this AKS ID, that is the resource ID for the AKS instance. And I'm going to then, go down into the namespaces and give you permissions at the namespace that we're working in. That's where our application is in. And so it goes and creates that role assignment. And so we can see there's a little bit of a difference in, so these are the role assignments. Oh, I forgot my query. So because I don't want to display everything. Or I suppose I need to, because I need to get the property names now, because I didn't copy what I wanted. So, all right, let's get the query on. Do you use the query functionality in Azure CLI?
I sure do. Yeah, I usually ask some co-pilots to help me with it. They've come up with some really clever ways to query different things, but yeah, I'm pretty familiar. It does make me miss WhereObject though a little bit.
Oh yeah,
from PowerShell days. But yeah, I definitely use the query quite a bit.
Role definition. This will simplify our output here a little bit for us. Role definition name. Yeah, where object and manipulating structured data. Yeah. Nothing beats PowerShell for manipulating structured data in a pipeline, or in a shell pipeline. So, let's table. Oh. There we go. All right. So, at our subscription level, we see something very much like what we saw in the Azure portal. That role definition. I have to finish actually typing the name. That's how you can tell this is a Learn Live, because every now and again you miss a word. So so we can see that we've got these cluster admin roles assigned. That's very similar to what we saw inside the IAM pane in the under our service. But now let's take a look at, and I'm just going to grab that and add it to my notes so that we can take a look at the role assignment in the role assignments in the namespace that we just assigned for you. And so there's only one role assignment in that specific namespace. So we can give, and we could have done reader, we could have done admin, whatever whatever need we had to meet. And so we can assign those with your Entra ID identity at the at the namespace level. So I think that's pretty cool. The challenge, because the challenge, with hey, we can assign roles at the resource level. We have all sorts of granularity in Kubernetes underneath. So
that's really cool, because it's just a lot more granularity, especially being able to do it at the namespace level and not having to keep track of separate sets of credentials on your cluster versus, because now I'd imagine this was going to show up in the portal. So you can see even in that one pane, all of them, because here you have to kind of query by the different scopes. Those would be the different drop-down menus that you'd see in the portal. But not having to manage them cluster by cluster that's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Now I don't think, so we can refresh this. I don't think this will show in here. I actually haven't looked, but my understanding is it does not show up in. So the namespaced ones will not show up here.
Interesting.
I think that's just a point in time problem, because the AKS automatic is in preview, and it is the first AKS instance that's defaulted, or first deployment that is defaulted to using Azure RBAC. You could opt into that when you created a cluster, but now that's just the default.
Interesting. Are there any other blades inside the cluster that would show namespace? I don't know if they would show the roles in the namespace, but I know that there's blades for namespaces.
Yeah, so we got namespaces. We could see if permissions show up in there. So that's our, and so CCW is Contoso Creative Writer. So my mind goes different.
I go College World. I know I'd be different. College World Series, BC, WC. That's local to where I'm at. But maybe if you look at YAML, I'm just curious if it shows up anywhere. If the role assignment would be in here anywhere in the YAML definitions, or.
Yeah, let's see. No, it doesn't appear to be.
Okay, so you'd still have to see or pull it through the Azure CLI for now. I'd imagine eventually that'll be updated in the IAM panel or Blade.
Yeah, or there'd be some way to view those things. All right, so.
So I'm notorious for side quests. So that's what you get when you invite me on a show.
That's all right. That's what I want. Right. And if anyone watching has questions about these things as we're going through, please drop them in the chat. Josh is peeking over at that periodically, and we'll get a chance. We'll take our best at answering your questions live as we go here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I mentioned we've got a couple of different roles. We can apply those at the namespace level to provide more granular access. But what we also have are a couple of other things, and one that's not so visible is API server connectivity. So in our we've got when we run our kubectl command, right? When we let's go to our terminal. When we run like kubectl get pods, right? We're going and hitting the API server, and when new jobs are dispatched and things like that, the nodes communicate with the API server. Well, the that should have. Let's get rid of that. So
the pesky notifications. Yeah.
I think I left it on where it minimizes to your system tray and not actually closes out when you close it out. But anyway, now we've been sidetracked. The API server by default was just sitting at the same network visibility as your nodes. Well, with AKS Automatic, and there are other ways you can deploy it, by default deploys it into a private VNet in your environment and puts it behind a load balancer, and your nodes know to communicate with that load balancer IP, so that there's never any routing outside of the VNet to talk to your API server. And you can constrain it. You can constrain it more, but what it does is it reduces the risk of unauthorized access, and it reduces that attack surface by not having that API server available to the public internet. Now, in the kubectl case here, right, we're the authentication mechanism that we've got going. Right now, I'm going over Azure VPN. We've got the it's one thing I didn't mention with the Entra ID integrated authentication. You do need to have kube login around. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not, but we do have one quick question, if you don't mind, another sidetrack. So we got a question in the chat that was asking if that permission at the namespace level is only available when you are using Automatic, or would a normal AKS cluster be able to do that same thing with the Azure CLI?
Great question. So a standard edition AKS cluster can do this as well, but you have to enable Entra ID authentication. So that there's separate steps to go through to do that. And with Automatic, it's just set up. It's not onerous to go through and set up. You can, but now you are migrating your permissions infrastructure from a cluster that you've been operating to a new one. So it's not something to do lightly. But if you're spinning up a new cluster and you don't want to do Automatic, you just want to deploy standard, you can enable Entra ID RBAC for those clusters, and then you can assign permissions at those scopes.
I assume that. So if you have the standard, you need to set up the OIDIC or something like that that's able to forward the tokens
OIDC.
between. Yeah, there we go. Between the tokens, is that part of the config that needs to be there?
Not necessarily. So that's for managed identity, and we're going to get to that.
Okay. We'll shelve that
And
for now.
for work, actually for workload identity.
Mhm.
So yeah, and yes, we're that's the next thing actually we're going to talk about.
Oh, teed it up perfect. There we
Yeah,
go.
yeah. So right, so we've got the API server. We've got I digressed to kube login.
Yes.
So the first, if you try to do the AZ AKS get credentials, and you get your credentials, and then you try to run kubectl the first time, if you don't have kube login installed, then you'll get an error and direct you to install kubectl, or to install kube login. AZ AKS install CLI will help ensure that you have kubectl installed, kube login, all the things you need to get started and connected to your cluster. So if you do get that error, you can either go try and find and install kube login on your own, or you can let the AZ CLI do it for you. If you're running on Linux, you probably have to sudo before you run this, because it's going to try to drop stuff into user local bin. But yeah, and so that would be the one little thing. Like kubectl just out of the box doesn't know Entra ID, but kube login will help you get there. All right, so API server. Now we've talked about workload identity. So this application that we're running uses workload identity, and it uses workload identity to wire up. And this is one thing that the previous lab went through. I don't think we got to it live, but it's in the walkthrough. But we used the service connector, which is a new feature for AKS Automatic, to connect with a managed identity to external services and wire up all of the federated authentication. So Service Connector did that for us. And it knows how to, I'll just pull this open here, take a quick look. Right, to set up that OIDC, so there's an OIDC issuer URL that the cluster needs to have, and you have to set that up at the cluster level. AKS Automatic sets that up for you. And then there's when you configure the federated authentication on the side of Entra ID, you tell it the Kubernetes namespace that's going to be making the request. And so I would do CW. We pick the service type, so it knows how to wire up, a variety of different services inside of Azure. We did OpenAI. We give a connection name. It asks you in what subscription, and then you find the service that you want to connect to. And it helps you wire all of this stuff up, because it's also got to create role permissions on the service side of things. So it really helps that whole process. Otherwise, there's a handful of command lines you can run to get your workload identity all wired up, but this makes it much easier. And I don't know, I kind of like it. The the other thing that was made easier was the ingress services and ingress, and that was set up last week as well. But we also took advantage of Copilot to help us write the little snippets that we needed to note in our ingress when we configure the ingress to allow the traffic routing for our API. But that's just a quick callback. We're not going to spend too much time with Copilot today, but we might have a use or two for it.
What ingress is it using? Can you click on the API? Does it show you the manifest?
Yeah. So We can actually go see the YAML. So any of these elements that we're looking at in the Kubernetes elements, when you go into them, you'll get an overview, but it'll show the YAML as well, and you can edit it, run dry run or
Nice.
review and save, so you can see how that would impact. But if we have questions about something, like let me see. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but we can always go back.
Circle back.
No. Since we're kind of talking about it now, let's just go ahead and so I have some workloads, right? And we can filter by namespaces. I care about API because this is my most resource constrained thing, and we're gonna look at scaling towards the end of things here today. But one of the elements for scaling, and since we're looking at the YAML view, and that's why we're here right now, when we have the YAML view up, it provides additional context for Copilot. And I can say stuff like, I would like to create a pod disruption budget for this deployment, right? And it's going to go and tell me, and if it's something I can do to edit this document, it might even let me edit it in place. And that's what it did with our ingress. But for this particular scenario, if Copilot is as helpful as it was to me earlier, then it's going to show me. It's going to give me an YAML actually to show me how to put together that pod disruption budget that then I can go add in, copy out, or put into my own file, go apply it, stick it into my repository so that it gets deployed every time, all of that kind of fun stuff, right? And then it gives me some other samples of questions that we can answer. And as we use this, if we give it feedback, it's only going to keep getting better. All right. So enough with that digression. We'll come back to that topic. We'll come back to that topic a little bit later. But so the workload identity. I had one last thing I think I wanted to mention with workload identity. And have you wired up workload identity, Josh?
I have, yeah, all by hand, so creating the endpoint on the cluster and then assigning the proper rights to the service and then configuring the issuer with that particular workload identity. So this connector seems very, very appealing.
Yeah. So here's it. Here's the actual configuration for ours. Authentication. It's workload identity. We point it to a managed identity that we have. We can adjust the role that was being created and assigned, and then it pulls back.
Was this post? So did you roll out automatic and then you got to walk through a couple more wizards, or were all these kind of defined when you created the cluster with automatic?
So when I created the cluster with automatic, service connector is there.
Okay.
Right. Fantastic. And then and then what we did in the previous workshop then was actually go through and create this connection. And the reason that we want to do that, we want to use workload identity, it's using a managed identity, which is credentials that are managed. The lifecycle is managed by the Azure platform and Entra ID. So there's an Entra ID representation and there's an Azure representation of this identity. It means there's no password for us sitting around somewhere that's going to get lost. That's going to get misplaced. It's going to get compromised and reused. And then we're using the federated auth so that the authentication request is coming back and forth and getting validated based on the Entra ID roles, right? So our authorization is all centralized, and so we can have a unified view of what has access to what, and it doesn't have credentials that are floating around waiting for anybody else to kind of grab them. All right. Now, I know we're spending a lot of time on the security stuff here, but again, that stuff's pretty important. There's just a couple of other elements that I want to highlight here. One's image cleaner. So image cleaner is, are you familiar with image cleaner, Josh? I
Yeah,
know
yeah,
you've worked,
to a degree. I haven't used it too much, but I'm familiar.
yeah. So because I know you've spent a lot of time working on the image integrity side of things.
Hmm.
Well, image cleaner helps us with periodic scans of images that are no of images that are on our nodes that may be stale and might end up with vulnerabilities in them. And so what we can do is we can, and it, by default, image cleaner is installed and running in AKS Automatic. You can install this in another SKUs, but by default it's enabled and it runs every 168 hours. Now, 168 hours. What
Under the hood, is that using Eraser maybe?
it is? It's using
Okay,
Eraser and
fantastic.
Trivi.
Oh, and Trivi to identify
Trivi's
probably.
it uses tools like Trivi, and I think there's some other stuff that it uses for vulnerability scanning, and then it will and then it will clean and remove images that are have vulnerabilities to them with Eraser. So yeah, so easy enough to see if it's enabled. You can definitely go and enable this on other clusters. AKS Automatic, it's just there and working for you, so you don't even have to think about it. The last thing on the security side that I wanted to look into or mention was the Azure policy bits. And so there is, right here we go. So Azure policy is integrated in AKS Automatic as well, and it allows you to define um, pod security policies, network policies, resource and quota limits, image policies, configuration best practices. There's a whole host of them that you can just apply by default, and you can set them to either warning, where you'll get warnings when you make configuration changes that could violate those, or you can put it in enforcement mode where it actually blocks changes that would violate the policies. So it makes it very easy to, it's all wired up and everything for you. It makes it very easy to turn those things on when you want them.
I did see the image integrity was on there on the list through the policy, which
Yes.
makes me happy. I spent a lot of time working with so the project under the hood for the image integrity piece is a project called Ratify, and so it's an admission controller, just like a lot of these other ones are, and it uses gatekeeper policies, which are then Azure policies are translated to the gatekeeper, and then that's what allows. So if you were to put it in enforce mode, it would be the admission controller to verify for different things. Very common cases to make sure that it's digitally signed. So you can say, hey, here's this Azure policy now. It's no longer defined at my cluster level. That says if these container images that you're about to deploy do not have a signature of such and such type and are not signed with this particular certificate, reject them from running. And that helps put some teeth on a lot of the secure supply chain policies that people are putting in place now.
Yep. And so we can see that we actually have we have pods that are getting and evaluating those policies. And then you mentioned Gatekeeper a minute ago. And we also have Gatekeeper up and running by default inside of our AKS Automatic cluster. So it's ready to receive those policies that you've worked on some of the tooling underneath that allows those policies to actually be evaluated. So that's cool. All right. So that's kind of a nice 30-minute overview of the security and policy capabilities that are out of the box inside of AKS. Let's dig into something that's a little more immediate and hands-on.
We got one more
And
question if we've got a moment.
of course,
So
yeah,
there's a question about workload identities. I feel like I could do like a 3-week deep dive into workload identity just to
yeah.
really iron it out. But I think the question more is, so does the generated token that the OIDC issuer is valid for a limited time and expires, does it also refresh the token and refresh the token automatically, and any failures during the refresh? Does it surface those? Like, how does that handle refreshing of the tokens and intra ID?
I'm not sure offhand on the refresh period. I do know I have not bumped into a problem with expired tokens, but you would see that in your audit logs for the target service. So you'll have the activity log, and it will show you. You can find failed connection requests and things like that there. Um, but that would be yeah, the tokens are definitely time limited. I don't know what that period is offhand, um, and I don't know. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure there's the refresh works. I haven't bumped into a problem where my workload identity has tried to access something with an expired token.
Yeah, my experience has been that as long as it can communicate to your intra ID, it'll be able to refresh those tokens. I had some kind of service disruptions where that lapsed, and I had temporary issues, and the activity log is where I caught that.
Yeah.
But again, just as you said, see, I don't know the details of that refresh interval and so forth, but um, be a good takeaway.
All right. So actually, I wanted to go back to my shell really quickly, and I'm just gonna kick off some activity against our site because we're gonna go take a look at logs. Now, one of the things that, as I mentioned, kind of when we kick this off, right, is that we need to be able to, see what's going on with our services while they're running, right? And sometimes, sometimes when we adopt cloud services, it can be kind of tricky to find those things. Fortunately, they made it right up front and center here. Get that going. This is actually with Container Insights because that's all wired up as well. Uh, Getting the live logs. So all of the logs for all of our pods are captured in log analytics into a log analytics workspace. And live logs lets you stream that stuff live, and then it's available for historical logs because you can only look at live logs one pod at a time. So if you have multiple pods, you may want to use the log analytics view, but you're going to have like a 3 to 5 minute delay on those logs being ingested and processed. So let's see, we should be getting some logs here. Oh, it's still. All right. While we're waiting for that, let's go take a look. Oh, yeah, we're gonna go for my dashboard. I've got a query all wired up. That was interesting. Gave me a response and, and then reran it. So this is similar to what you'd see in the live logs. It wouldn't have as much detail here, but you do get your log messages. That's why we're getting some rate limiting errors. But we can see article generation started. We can see that we're getting some messages based on what our application was doing, which then gives you a place to kind of go back and troubleshoot. And right now, we are looking at the logs for one No, thank you. I appreciate the extra info, but not right now. Thank you. Right now, we're looking at a specific container. We could filter this to everything in a namespace. You know, go. What was it? Pod namespace. What is it?
Looks right. Pod namespace.
Yeah, pod.
Do you have to change it to equal, like equal CCW?
Well, it's just gonna check a column there. Union, yeah. Or maybe pod namespace is. Let's see. It might be a. Yeah, it's in the container v2 namespace.
Gotcha.
So we could get our container IDs with a different query and then union that in. There's a lot you can do with KQL, and as much as it would, as much fun as it would be to watch me go and figure that out. Let's see, container name. Maybe that's it's just container ID and container log. Okay, interesting. All right, something to play around with later. Or I could even ask Copilot. Help me with my query. But unsaved edits, that's fine. But the live logs, so we actually hit some errors, which is why we weren't seeing the live logs that I was expecting. But we did have them. We did have them in our historical logs. But the live logs lets you say that's one of the downsides of live logs is it's literally live logs. It's not it's not like if you went and ran kubectl log, because we could still do that. And with the login that we have, we could do, kubectl logs. Actually, let me get the pod name. Get pods. So if we were to go and grab.
Oh, you'll need to add the namespace, yeah. That always gets me.
There we go. All right, so we get everything in that's in the console buffer. That's not necessarily the same with live logs as they come out. All right. The other thing I wanted to point out in terms of monitoring our live workloads is let's pop back in here under monitoring. So here you can go directly to that logs that we were just in, but there's this workbooks section. And have you looked at these at all before?
I have not. This is brand new to me.
All right, so this stuff is pretty cool. So you can create your own custom workbooks and using metrics and information that are pulled from Container Insights. But there's some out-of-the-box ones that you get. And some of these things we're going to actually see, like they're kind of duplicated from what we can see in Grafana. But one that I always find really, really useful is this cluster optimization workbook. And so it's going to show you, and you can specify time ranges, but liveness probes, failures, event anomalies. So where you might see some weird things happening together. But the thing I find most useful, while the other ones are useful, the one that's more regularly useful, I shouldn't say, because it's more useful on a day-to-day basis, is a container optimizer. And it looks at the workloads that you have deployed and compares the usage and the requests that it makes to the resource limits and requests that you have set for your application. So you can fine tune based on how they're actually performing for your resource utilization. And where this becomes important is one of the next things that we have to look at, which is scaling, right? Because scaling is very often driven based on the resource utilization and demand. So comparing, the current utilization compared to what it says is its limit is. So you get, some graphs that show you, all right, we've got the suggested request, the suggested limit, and then the current what's currently being requested when you spin up the pod, and the current limit. So you can see our limits are way higher than the actual usage. So we could pull those down and get a more dense packing of our workloads onto our nodes. We're also less likely to scale when our application needs it, because the utilization is not going to be anywhere near the thresholds, but the application might be disk bound, or it might be waiting on other services, and we need to scale out so we can at least continue processing workloads and things.
So are these limits here what are defined in like the manifest with the deployment, like the CPU memory? Okay, and so to get a more accurate scaling up with the automatic, if those thresholds are more accurately defined using this data, then we're going to have better scaling up and down, right?
Yep.
Okay, that's cool.
Yep. So and we're going to take so we got one more thing to take a look at, and then we're going to look at scaling. And it's in the same vein. So, similar information to what we can get if we have Azure Managed Prometheus and Azure Managed Grafana set up. We can look at these views. We can look at these views either in dashboards that we create, or there's a number of default ones that are created for us that provide for a really good look at what's actually happening in our clusters. Let's just take a look at one of these. Let's go by cluster resources, or we'll look at namespace. All right, so we're going to look at our CCW namespace. You can see we had a little bit of a spike happening here. That's probably when I shot off some additional requests at it and made things unhappy. But you get your CPU visualization, memory utilization. You can see what your quotas are, compared to limits, network utilization. So all of the operations data that you require and are interested in becomes available to you in nice visualizations. And there's other, depending on what you want to see, that's compute resources. You can drill specifically into networking. Use is utilization. Utilization, saturation, and errors. And the node exporter method ones, those are so you can get Windows stats that look a lot like your Linux stats. So, all right, let's dive into the last thing we wanted to look at today, which is scaling. Now, with scaling, we have a couple of options. We have a horizontal pod autoscaler, a vertical pod autoscaler. We have KADA, which is Kubernetes event-driven autoscaling. And we have node auto provisioning. So node auto provisioning is a newer capability, and it leverages the Carpenter open source project. So all of those things are wired up in AKS Automatic. The horizontal pod and vertical pod autoscaler, those are just there. KADA was always an add-on that is connected and connected for you in Automatic, and they actually put in a nice little way to create your scaled objects and scaled jobs in KADA from within the portal. So normally you'd be crafting those things in the YAML by hand. We can actually go through and specify, hey, if I want to scale my API, I can pick those things. I can give it my thresholds for how often it should pull for the resource state, how long it should wait between state changes, my replica, number of replicas. I can put some timing around that.
What other trigger types do they have for the KADA memory service bus? Okay, so you could send some events to service bus, have that pick it up and scale. Very cool.
Yep.
And then kind of more common by time and CPU usage and memory usage. That's awesome.
Yep. So the thing, one of the things to consider here. So I mentioned vertical pod autoscaler and horizontal pod autoscaler. So horizontal pod autoscaler can scale on CPU and memory utilization based on thresholds you have set in your deployment, or for your container image. You can also scale those on those metrics with KADA. So you want to be careful that you only configure one of those. Right, and the suggestion usually is to let KADA do it, especially since KADA is installed and ready with AKS Automatic. But you want to have one thing, and because we can set up multiple scaling rules and things with KADA, better to centralize it there. Vertical pod autoscaler allows you to dynamically adjust the thresholds for resources. So if there's more demand for CPU and memory, it could bump those thresholds. Now, if you have that set and KADA monitoring CPU or memory, right, now you could be constantly changing your targets and not necessarily get the scaling behavior that you expect, right? So, vertical pod autoscaler bumps up your, how much memory a workload can use, but KADA's looking at memory utilization in like maybe it's looking for like a 60% memory utilization. Oh, hey, random 60% memory utilization. Right, like if it's looking for, but if your threshold keeps going up, we're never going to scale out, right? As long as it can keep scaling up on that node. And then node auto provisioning takes advantage of your workloads. Like if it needs to scale more workloads onto nodes, but you don't have space, it can provision new nodes for you inside for your cluster. So there's a whole lot that I mean, we could spend a Learn Live diving into the details of any one of these kind of buckets of focus here, but the thing I want to folks to be able to take away is, if you want to get started quickly with Azure Kubernetes Service for your intelligent apps or whatever else, the AKS Automatic provides a really good way to get started with all of the right things wired up. Now, there's a whole ecosystem of choice, and you could find and change things out however you'd like. But this gets you started. It helps, and we didn't even talk about things like service mesh. And service mesh is able to be enabled easily on Kubernetes as well. Istio is ready and raring to go. Right, so there's a number of different capabilities and features that are just ready and ready to go without having to go hunt them down, find them, and enable them separately. So, Josh, did did we hit some of the things that that you thought we might be covering, or was this all just sort of like, I've heard this stuff before, and
I think we hit everything and more. I didn't realize how much came with the automatic. I mean, I'm definitely going to try to upgrade some of my deployment scripts to use it, just because a lot of this stuff, like I'll start bare bones, and then eventually and almost ultimately I start to add in all of these things that we've just talked about, and then there are more CLI commands, or there are more addition to the Terraform. So just having that available to me, I think will be an awesome win. That connector for me, it sold me with the workload identity, simplifying that. Now I'm curious. I want to start to tinker with the scaling rules and just see how I can get them to misbehave. Just so I like to tinker with those things and see those edge cases, because they ultimately happen in the real world. So
right now, and when you start tinkering with those scaling rules, you really have to know how your application behaves, and then be able to put the load on it that will make it behave that way, so you can trigger those scaling events. And so the reason I was talking about scaling the API layer is the API is where the API layer is where all of the logic and workflow is happening inside this application. There's some stuff that happens in the web front end, but the web front end is a client-side app. So the web container is really just a web server that gives you some static files, and then everything dynamic is running locally and then calling back to the API. So scaling the web container is much less of a concern, because it's got much lower demand on it. So when you look at scaling, you really got to know your workloads. You can't just slap these scaling rules will work for all, right? It's not one of those things.
Never the case. No.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate you spending the time here with me. Just a quick recap. If I can find my list here, I think we talked about, we've talked significantly about the security posture of AKS Automatic and things that are set there. And again, many of those things you can do with AKS Standard. You just have to configure them. AKS Automatic, it's automatic, right? Like that's the tagline there. We looked at tools we can use to troubleshoot applications on AKS, looking at using Managed Grafana and Managed Prometheus to look at some of our metrics. And then we talked about the tools that we have to control scaling. I think we hit everything that we wanted to today. Any last thoughts or ideas that you wanted to share with folks, Josh?
The biggest takeaway for me is to actually kick the tires on some of the policies that are kind of built into here, enabling those policies, so you can take Azure policy and then apply those to your cluster. That's what I want to spend some more time on and dig into. So this has motivated me and inspired me to pick up that task for the rest of the day, probably.
Good deal.
Yeah.
All right. With that, thank you all for joining us. Thanks for the questions. Really appreciate them. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. To learn more about this series, watch past episodes, and register for future sessions, you can follow the link that's on the screen or in the chat. We're always looking to improve our sessions and your experience. If you have any feedback for us, we'd love to hear what you have to say. You can find that link on the screen or in the chat. Today's event code is 23497. We'll see you at the next one.